You are currently muted. You may use the chat feature to send messages directly to me. I will open this up after the panelists have finished their presentations. You will be able to speak if you raise your hand. Each panelist will speak for 10 to 15 minutes. I hope that I will not need to remove anyone, but I do reserve the right to remove anyone who behaves inappropriately. Unfortunately, as you may be aware, there have been some instances of Zoom bombing where people have used Zoom sessions to promote unwelcome speech. You are welcome to share any thoughts you want, but I expect you to do so in an appropriate and an intellectual manner befitting a rational discussion. So as we are doing this somewhat differently due to COVID-19, there may well be glitches along the way. This is our first time doing an entire Zoom panel for our language and social justice speech series. I hope it's successful, but there could be issues along the way, and I thank you for your patience. The New School has a long history of commitment to social justice. However, one area where it has lagged is in addressing the linguistic disparity in the world. La justicia no es solamente por los que hablan inglés, es por todo el mundo. 公道正义不该只限用于说英语的人，是向每个人都值得拥有。العدل ليس فقط لمن يتحدثون الإنجليزية، لكن لكل بشر. Justice is not just for those who speak English. It is for everyone. In light of this, today's panel is particularly germane. Tonight, I am happy to welcome three great panelists who will explore how and why English has become indispensable and what the implications are for a more equitable world. Our title tonight is Why Can't They Just Learn English? The Politics of Hypercentral Language. English has become the hypercentral language that is now dominant in social, economic, political, military, and cultural arenas. The increasing pressure to learn English for material success couples with a decreasing need for monolingual English speakers to learn other languages. This panel will discuss the practical implications of the role of English in the world and what this means for social justice for speakers of all languages. I'm very happy and honored to be able to welcome our participants tonight. First, J.P. Gerald is a doctoral student at CUNY Hunter College. His research focuses on the intersection of racial and linguistic discrimination, particularly the construction of whiteness among educators. He hosts a podcast on these topics called Unstandardized English, and you can find his hot takes on Twitter at JPDGerald. He has a wife and an infant son, and as such, hasn't slept in a while. Jenere Montañez is an MA-TESOL graduate student at the New School and holds an MS Ed, Masters of Science in Education in Early Childhood. She has spent the last 27 years in youth development and recently has returned to early childhood setting to provide ESL services for children in K-1. She is married and has 2 daughters. Kim Edmonds is a curriculum specialist for the Tools for Clear Speech program at Baruch College, CUNY. She holds an MA in TESOL, and her interests include pronunciation and grammar pedagogy, the ethics of listening in multilingual contexts, and the applications of descriptive linguistics principles in grammar teaching. She is also an instructor of pedagogical grammar in the Hunter College MA TESOL program and the New School Certificate in Teaching English. Once again, please be aware that tonight's session will be recorded. You are currently muted. You may use the chat feature to send messages directly to me. I will open this up after all the panelists have finished their presentations. Thank you, and without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce J.P. Gerald.
Welcome, folks. Good evening. Just a quick disclaimer. You may hear my son or my dog in the background, but I think we're all used to these video calls by now, so don't be surprised if it happens. All right, so well, good evening, everyone. My name is JPB Gerald, and I want to speak about the danger of leaving things unsaid. A little bit about me and my work. These days, I'm a doctoral student at CUNY Hunter College pursuing an EDD in instructional leadership with research focusing on language and race, and as I said, whiteness. But when my career started, I left New York to teach English in South Korea in 2008. Now, I got the job with no real qualifications. I had about 5 hours of learning how to make a lesson plan, although I did have an American passport, and that's pretty much all I needed. This didn't really bother me at the time, but I gradually came to understand the danger of that sort of privilege. I started to analyze the implications of that sort of free ride I received, and although I think I ended up a pretty good teacher, there was no incentive to improve if you were a quote-unquote guest English teacher there. It was a lot easier to just go to parties and roll into work the next day like a lot of my friends did. So I came back to New York in 2010, certain I needed to improve my knowledge of the language and my teaching skill. And I started here, or there, I guess, at the new school in the MAT-SOL program. Now, I did my homework, but through no fault of the program, I hadn't really yet found a passion in the field. It was a job, and as many of you know, not the world's most lucrative profession. So I worked at odd teaching jobs around the city that didn't provide benefits, and then I finally got a management job at a nonprofit with adult language learners. So I had a little bit less of a precarious life, and I settled into that for a while. Now, many of you know Leslie Painter-Farrell, who I'm sure is watching on Finn's iPhone. And at one point, maybe 5 years ago, she told me it was time for me to start publishing. Now, I demurred and I weaseled out of it because I still didn't feel like I had anything worthwhile to say. What unique insight could I bring to the field? I didn't really just want to present a new way to teach vocabulary, which is valuable, but it's not my passion, so I was stuck. Sorry, I'm scrolling down. However, it turns out the entire time I was learning what I needed to about the field, just from my experience. I was gaining resonant experiences that weren't limited just to me. And as I started trying to get myself heard and find a way to speak at conferences and at things like this, I started to identify a discomfort I'd been ignoring for my entire tenure in the field. So the question implied in the title of this program is what happens when we are hyper-focused on the promulgation of English and a certain type of English to the detriment of both the perpetuation of other languages and the hegemony of monolingual English speakers. I was always uncomfortable with how my career began and the completely shiftless people I'd known in South Korea, many of whom were simply, they just didn't consider it a real career at all. It was a stepping stone to something better, something real. I paid attention to the people who were presented as the field's luminaries, who all were, shall we say, superficially similar. And I noticed at every job I had how the students who were poorer and farther from a certain ideal always got the short shrift. I started to listen to the internal tension that I felt and the growing discomfort I had with the field, and I started to read, to talk, and to think. I came to realize that so much of what we talk about when we talk about social justice is just empty rhetoric, because we're afraid to look directly at ourselves as the problem. So in my view, there are twin concepts that explain our inability to truly address the hegemony of English and the damage it does to learners into other languages. The first concept is the idea of deservedness and meritocracy, sort of two sides of the same coin. Everything we, especially in economically powerful Western countries like the United States, have been taught about ourselves in contrast to other nations is that we are the most advanced, the most correct, and that our way of life is what students should aspire to. We're the quote unquote first world, right? Meanwhile, our infrastructure is so poor that all of this stuff is happening, but never mind. I'm sure you watching this may be rushing to type, well, this does not describe me. I don't think I'm better than other people, but think about the way that you teach pronunciation, grammar, other language skills. The pressure to learn English for material success implies that any so-called error in linguistic production means that any income a person doesn't thus obtain is due to their own linguistic ability or inability, and that they thus deserve their fate. If you think about meritocracy, right, like the idea that those with exceptional merit are deserving of better rewards and that the system of societal organization is the fairest of all, we don't thus address who determines what is and isn't correct. You need to learn business English to get a job, so if you don't do it, then that's what you get. You need to learn academic English to go to school, and if you don't do it, that's your fault, that's what you get. And you need to do both of these things to earn money, and in this country, if you don't pull yourself up by your bootstraps and make money, you're lazy and you deserve what you get. And who gets to teach that academic English? Who gets to teach that business English? Who gets most of those jobs in South Korea or Japan or Spain, right? By and large, it's white people. Now look at me. I'm not white, But I only got that job in South Korea because I went to an Ivy League school so they could overlook the flaw of my not being white. They wanted white teachers so they could advertise accordingly. And that happens here too, even if not as explicitly. And race isn't a topic that we talk about that much in ELT. We talk a lot about culture. We talk about nationality. We talk about holidays and heroes and cuisine. But if we don't consider race, if we don't become racial linguistically literate, then we are ignoring a very important part of language. So how does that relate to deservedness and meritocracy? I trust I'm going to bring these points together. Well, think about the unspoken benefit of accepting a job that you got merely because of the type of passport you have, and then telling people, sometimes adults, that how they speak or write is wrong. Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa would say that one of the biggest errors we make in teaching English is ignoring the unmentioned white listener. Because when we tell a student that their sentence is wrong or that their accent is not ideal, what we're saying without saying it is that white listeners will not understand you. We place the problem within the English learner and keep them on the margins of society while we stay more central ourselves, even if we speak only one language. In a way, we need to promote this relative deservedness because, as you all know, and as I said before, this field doesn't really pay well, right? We can get every degree under the sun, and I should say that because I'm getting yet another degree, but none of us really turns out to be wealthy after teaching English for a while. So in order for us to succeed within this paradigm, we need to feel we deserve our roles on top of the pyramid. And so we silently perpetuate the myth that if an employer or a school refuses to learn what's necessary to accommodate a speaker of another language, the problem is that speaker and not the institution or the society that produced it. Because if we acknowledge this, if we say this out loud, then many of us may flounder and search for purpose. My point then, as we experience a time when a lot is surely in flux, is not that we don't teach English anymore. No, you have a job to do, well, hopefully. But we also have a responsibility to provide a broader lens. Our students have been taught that they are the problem and that they deserve to struggle. What if, instead of telling our students that they're wrong, when we offer an edit or a correction or a suggestion, we frame it in terms of the fact that someone with power may choose not to understand them, right? What if instead of telling someone to quote unquote reduce their accent, we tell them that they are gaining an additional accent, a skill that the white listener is unwilling to recognize? What if we didn't lie and say that there's such a thing as a neutral accent, right? We have a lot of options if we are more honest. The path to true social justice is authenticity, in my view, at least. People say that changing the way we approach our work is hard, but it's only hard if you don't want to do the work on yourselves and on your institutions. Maybe it's silly, but I think I'm sort of a cynical optimist, right? I think we're all fully capable of making these same changes towards anti-oppressive ideals, and that not to do so is a deliberate choice. You see what I'm saying about cynical optimism? I made these changes. I evolved from a shiftless teacher coasting in South Korea with no real interest in the issues surrounding me to a scholar with a critical eye on the ways that racism has shaped our field and needs to be fought by all of us if we care about creating a different world. We know it's going to be a different world after whenever this ends, 2020, 2021, who knows? And each and every one of us needs to make the conscious choice to fight the oppression endemic to our field if we want to come out of this a little bit closer to justice for the students who need our support. Thanks.
Thank you, Justin. Okay, so our next speaker is Janire Montañez. Welcome, Janire.
Hi, thank you, Justin. My name is Janire Montañez. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey, how I got here to the program and why I do it. So I was born here in New York City. However, my mom got married and she moved to Puerto Rico, where they spoke Spanish, but we were required to take an English class. And it was okay for me because my mom spoke English, and so did my stepdad. He was going to be a lawyer. About the age of, I was 9 going on 10 years old, my mom divorced and she moved back to New York. So when I came back to New York, school in Puerto Rico ended in May, school in New York started in September, and my mother went to go register me in the local school, where the principal there asked, maybe we need to hold her back since she doesn't speak the language. And she's like, maybe she should do June here because she doesn't speak the language. So my mom was my biggest advocate, and she said, no, you're going to put her in her correct grade. She earned it. I was a straight A student, had 4.0 average. And I went into a fifth grade class where it was back then, there used to be heterogeneous classes. Homogeneous classes, sorry, where I was in the lowest fifth grade class, close to the bilingual class or the special ed class. It took a year and a half. I was one grade behind in reading throughout the school year, that particular school year. However, my math scores had came back and they were through the roof. Back then, way back in the day, I was scoring a ninth grade level in fifth grade. However, I had a teacher that used to pull me out. I think it was for ESL. I don't remember. I remember she would sit me down and we would go over these books, and she used to tell me, you need to pronounce it like this. And the more and more I learned English, the more and more I lost my Spanish. I think I was 16 years old. I was working at McDonald's. I was in high school. I was going to go to college, and I was going to be a mechanical engineer. I was working at McDonald's as a cashier, and I was having problems with my calculus class and my engineering class. And the two guys behind, that were the cooks, during their break, they would sit down with me. They were from Mexico. And one was a civil engineer and the other one was a mechanical engineer. And they helped me, and I passed my classes and I graduated, and I went to City College to become a mechanical engineer. If it wasn't for them and them teaching me, I would have never gotten there. However, as the classes in City College got harder, even though I spoke English, even though I wrote English, I lost most of my accent. Only when I'm tired or upset, you can hear it. But the higher I got into these classes, and the more the colors changed. It was more, I was one of the few females there, definitely one of the few people of color there, and definitely somebody that didn't belong there, according to one of my professors. I would never forget him. He told me that I didn't belong, then I should go back where I came from. Little I wanted to tell him I came from 125th Street. But they threw me out. I got out, I went back, I went to work full time. I had my son to take care of, and I ended up working at Barnes and Noble's on the main store that used to be on 18th Street. And I worked there for many years. And I got interested more and more in teaching and in doing stuff. So I went back to school and I got my master's in education. But before that, I used to work after school. And in after school, I became a director. I ran the after school in DOE buildings in New York City. And I noticed more and more that the population that I serve were people who did not speak English. A good portion was Hispanics, people that spoke Spanish. I had a large Bengali population, and then in recent years has been Africans. So I got my master's in education. I went to go teach. I taught kindergarten for a while. I substituted. I did different things. I did ABA, but I wasn't happy. So while I taught, I also did after school, and then I realized I have to do something. I have to do something for people in my neighborhood, for people that people like my mother who advocated for me. People that I see, these parents that feel that the teacher's always right, and they call them, Miss and Mr. and Professori, and then they're telling their children you're wrong, and it's not them. It's sometimes it's those teachers who don't understand that learning a new language is hard. It takes a piece of you, especially when you lose who you are. So as I was a teacher. I stopped being a teacher. I went to the city to work for the Department of Youth and Community Development. I didn't stay there too long either because I didn't like it. I went back into community development. I went back to Aspida of New York. And that's where I found my passion. One day I was filling out somebody's rent receipt because she couldn't talk to her landlord. The next day she came back, can you help me speak to the teacher, because I know my daughter's doing something correctly and I can't get through to the teacher. And then one day my supervisor goes, why don't you just go and teach this to them? So I went, just a disclaimer, my husband works for New School. So there was this TESOL program, and it's like, okay, let me try it out. So I started in 2014 the first time, and I walked into a classroom and I was so uncomfortable in there. Everybody around me had taught overseas. Everybody was white, and I was the only Hispanic person there. So I dropped the program and picked it up again in 2016. So in 2016, it was spring. I had walked into a class which looked a little bit more diverse. There was one Spanish girl in there. There were 3 Black people in there, and the rest were white. And just like in public school, we all gravitate to what we know. Spanish girl sat next to me. We spoke. We were friends until she graduated, and I stood behind. And then we mingled. And it's not to be racist or say that, but it's how I felt. I felt that people trying to take away my language, trying to take away my accent, to take away my culture to some point. When I was in school, I remember being in school and I had a high averages, and because I did tell my SAT scores, I scored perfect score on the math. And then if I tell you what I scored in the English, I'm ashamed. I scored like in the low 300s. I just couldn't do the standardized English testing, but I was good at everything else. And when I walked in after I got a master's in education from Mercy College, where everybody looked like me, where everybody was in the same neighborhood I was, I was able to complete it here. But I walked into new school and I couldn't. I struggled and I cried and I told my husband I didn't want to be here no more. However, between Leslie and Leo and their support, I realized that this is my place. A few years have passed. I've been doing this program for a while because of work. One class here, one class there. I took this social justice class, and then I realized that I was angry for a long time, and I was able to express that. And the anger came because something was taken away from me when I was very young, when I came into this country. It was, they took a piece of me by taking my language, by telling me I couldn't speak with an accent anymore, that it had to be pronounced perfectly. And that's when I wanted to advocate even more and help people. My story is not about teaching abroad, but teaching in the community. So I volunteer at the outreach program here, and I help parents. So my classes don't look like regular English classes like you teach. What they look like is currently I'm doing an online class for Grace Church, where remote teaching, I teach kindergarten. I teach in a charter school. I teach face to face. But the parents that in my outreach program, the kids mostly go to New York City schools and DOE, and they told them, here, work it out yourselves. And they're frustrated. They have work to do. They have other kids. And my purpose now is to teach them how to advocate for the kids through English. So I do this for people like me when I was younger, for my parents. I do it for people that I worked for when I was in after school, and for the current parents that I have in my own school, where they're struggling to catch up with the language, and administrations don't understand that this new way of is not really helping them. So that's why I'm here, and I should be graduating this year, hopefully, so I can just spread the love to my community. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Jenny Ray. Okay, and our final speaker tonight is Kim Edmonds. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Kim Edmonds, and I just want to say thanks for being here, and thank Leo and Leslie and Charity and everyone at the New School who organized this event. So I'll start with a little bit of background on me. I'm a teacher of English to speakers of other languages, and like a lot of us in the field, I wear many hats. My primary role is as the curriculum specialist for a program called Tools for Clear Speech at Baruch College. And what is that? What do we do there? Essentially, we offer services and resources to Baruch's multilingual and non-native English speaking students to help them improve their oral communication skills and intelligibility. In addition to that role, I also work as an adjunct instructor for a handful of other colleges in the city, including the New School Certificate in Teaching English. So I'm both an English language teacher and a teacher of English language teachers. And in that latter role, my main areas of focus are pronunciation and grammar pedagogy. So I want to talk briefly about some of the experiences I've had in these roles and others that illustrate the tensions that I've felt throughout my time in this field and that have informed my thinking on the theme for tonight. Technically, my first job in TESOL was as an ESL peer tutor when I was an undergrad student in Atlanta. I got a few dozen hours of training and something like $10 an hour to meet with multilingual students who are my peers in college and talk about their writing with them. I still really clearly remember my first tutee. Her name was Paulina, and how nervous I was that I was supposed to give language feedback to this person who was 2 years my senior and who was writing in a discipline that I didn't know anything about. And at the time, it didn't occur to me to question this dynamic or the institutions and the assumptions that had brought it about. She was there for English help because English was part of the criteria by which she was evaluated, and I was there to provide the help. So eventually that dynamic became more reciprocal. My tutees and I made discoveries together, and I realized I wanted this to be my career if I could just learn some more things. And fast forward to now when I'm still doing that learning. These days, whenever I teach a class of upper intermediate or advanced adult language learners, I have a tried and true sort of opening day that I have planned. On day one, we want to know who the students are and what motivates them, and we really want to get them talking. And finding a topic that everyone has something to say about can be a little challenging, but I've had success with a theme that all of us in the room share an interest and an investment in, for better or for worse, which is English. I show them 2 short TED Talks. The first one is Patricia Ryan's Don't Insist on English, which is a teacher's questioning of the dominance of English and teachers' role as gatekeepers to enfranchisement. And I also show them Jay Walker's The World's English Mania, which calls English, quote, a hope for a better future for many, unquote, and the world's, quote, common language to solve its common problems, unquote. So then we talk about it, answer some questions, and the result is almost always a pretty lively discussion. The students have spent a lot of time and money and energy on English, and they have a lot to say. Do we all end up agreeing on how things should be? No, but we do acknowledge how they are, which is that English is hypercentral, as Deswan puts it, that it's probably not going anywhere anytime soon, and that it undeniably privileges its speakers in both obvious and subtle ways. I am one of those privileged speakers. I grew up in a monolingual English-speaking household, and that, coupled with other types of privilege, including white privilege, gave me access to opportunities that many don't have. I don't have to worry about being judged for my grammar or my dialect. I was taught academic register from a young age. When I speak, listeners don't use my accent to determine whether or not they will choose to understand me. One vein of research in this area that I've been pursuing and interested in since grad school is the role and the biases of listeners in interactions between native and non-native speakers. And with my colleagues at TFCS, or Tools for Clear Speech at Baruch, some of whom I think are watching now, I've had the opportunity to continue and deepen that work collaboratively. So it's been well established that it's possible to speak with an accent and still be perfectly understood. Research shows that listeners are biased by stereotypes. They will use a speaker's accent or sometimes just appearance to make distorted judgments about that person's intelligibility. And if listeners decide that they can't understand non-native speakers and they take no steps to make communication a shared effort, then as Rosina Lippi-Green puts it, the full burden of communication is put directly on the speaker. This is a problem. This is one reason why just learning English may not be enough to guarantee acceptance into these insular English-speaking communities, like academia, for instance, and why the hypercentrality of English is undeniably a social justice issue. This comes up in another discussion that I have with the teachers in my intro to pedagogical grammar classes. Most of the teacher candidates are multilingual themselves, and the curricula that I teach use general, or also called standard American English, as a model. And we try not to approach language learning from a deficit perspective, and we talk about the value of other languages and other English dialects. Most of my students are K-12 teachers and teachers of immigrants, and they want to know how to talk to their students about the academic language they need for school or work without invalidating their other linguistic resources. Right now, we use an appropriateness framework that uses context as rationale for choosing one dialect or language over another. But scholars really rightly point out that this is still a form of privileging one single variety of one single language and marginalizing others as informal or inappropriate or not the right choice right now. And this exclusion is another problem, as is perpetuating the idea that perfect adherence to a single grammar is a prerequisite for entrance into the global English-speaking community. There's evidence that some of these problems can be addressed with education and exposure and teaching and teacher training that's informed by social justice and the kinds of reframing options that Justin described earlier, but there's still work to be done in implementing those actions, all myself included. So I just want to echo what Justin mentioned about the danger of leaving things unsaid. I'm still fairly early in my career, and I've also struggled with doubting whether or not I had anything worthwhile to say. It's really easy, after all, to just keep my head down, especially because I definitely don't have all the answers or solutions to these problems. But I have a responsibility to advance the things that I believe in, and one of those things is the plurality of English and the need for monolingual speakers to become proficient in its global varieties, as well as, of course, the value of other global and central languages. So to get there, a lot more voices need to be heard. So while I'm here to talk and have a conversation and offer what I can, I'm also really here to listen. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kim. So yes, as Kim says, we're here to listen. I mean, we really want this to be a dialogue going. You know, each of our panelists has spoken about the role of English on their lives from very different perspectives in many ways, but we'd certainly welcome other perspectives, other ways of understanding the role of English in our lives and how that drives these questions of social justice. So with that, I'm going to open it up. Please feel free to either raise your hand or send a chat message if you'd like to ask a question. Trying to see if anybody's raised their hand because I can't see everything at the same time.
It'll say one person has raised their hand or something.
Yeah.
If someone raises their hand.
Should do, right? Let's see. Okay. Or send a chat.
Come on, people.
Okay, so we do have a question here in the chat from Maya. Would you like to, I'll unmute you. Would you like to ask the question directly? I've unmuted you, Maya.
Hello?
Hello,
Can you hear
yeah,
me?
yeah. You're kind of faint, but we can hear you.
Okay, so the question is for Kim Edmonds. I like this tools for clear speech. I love the animation, but I see that it's very English centered. It spends a lot of time with the different speech patterns. Well, I don't know what you were calling English centered. I meant, you know, whatever you said, Kim Edmonds. So I was wondering how you can be part of it. I love it, but it's too English centered for me. I love the animation. What do you say about it? I can't hear now.
Sorry, Maya, I didn't hear, I think what was the key part of your question. You mentioned, what do I say about it, and that it's very English centered, but you asked something about the role. Can you repeat that again?
Well, I just wanted to know, you said that's what you're doing at the TESOL school. You are working with that program that is on that I can get through the website, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the animation is great, but it is too English centered, and so I was wondering, um, what, I mean, how could you change it?
Hmm. That's a great question. So I think what Maya is referring to is the Tools for Clear Speech website and materials that we've designed and we offer online that are focused on, she's describing the animations for the different phonemes of English that are focused on pronunciation and intelligibility for it's definitely designed for Baruch students, but it's available to anyone who has internet access and the required technology. So I agree with you that it is very English centered, and the goal of that website and the materials that are offered has been to illustrate and provide examples of and practice with knowledge about pronunciation features in English that are intended to help learners improve their intelligibility, which is their ability to be understood. And so one of the core tenets of our program is that, as I mentioned before, we know and research shows that you don't need to speak without an accent, whatever that means, because everybody has an accent, in order to be understood. And so our goal has never been accent elimination or any of those unrealistic aims, but really intelligibility. And so I think for making it more English or less English centered, I think that's a really interesting idea, because it has been very framed as how can you pronounce these phonemes, for example, or use the rhythm of English in a way that will sort of mirror the features of English as it's spoken by native speakers. So I think that one way that I'm interested in further adapting it is to consider and to more center the features of English that are more universally, the features of spoken English that are going to actually have the most impact on intelligibility, and to decenter the features that, for example, the TH sound is very salient to lots of people, but it really doesn't have any measurable effect on intelligibility, whether or not you pronounce it like an S or an F or anything. So I think we could maybe include some clearer language on the website that better directs learners to and users to features that are not necessarily that are going to be more effective in improving their intelligibility. It would also be wonderful to have parallel sites and information about the pronunciation systems of other languages. I have a little bit of knowledge about the phonology and phonetics of Spanish, and we could maybe do some more direct comparisons, and so learners can bring their own first languages into their learning and do a little bit more direct juxtaposition that way. So those are really good thoughts, and I think we'll definitely put some additional work into that. So thank you. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, we have a couple more questions. We have one from Kelsey, I think. Kelsey, I've unmuted you. Would you like to share your question?
Hi, so I was just wondering, so I teach, or I have taught ESL in the past and also worked in teacher education. And I'm wondering for each of you, from your different experiences and perspectives and the different populations you work with, what do you see as the main point of your students learning English? And why do they learn English? Why is it important for them? What goals do you have for them, or do you see them having?
Well, it's dependent on my different contexts. And hi, Kelsey. When I worked at the nonprofit, I had this interesting mix of people there were a lot of younger mothers who had kids in the preschool. It was like a Head Start, and they just wanted to communicate with teachers, like Janeria was talking about, right? They wanted to communicate with teachers or a doctor or something like that. And then you had what people sometimes call as trailing spouses, where their husbands, and it was always a husband, had come here for some business thing, and they were here with nothing to do. Which means that in the class, they had very different purposes. And unfortunately, and this is one of the reasons I went back to school, the people who had no reason to do anything else came to class every single day because they had nothing to do. And the people who really needed help, they'd miss class here or there, and I didn't have a problem with it, but then, they started to feel a little bit excluded from the population. So I've had those experiences when I worked at a really just unsavory for-profit school in Queens. They came presumably so they could go to school afterwards, but mostly they were getting scammed out of their money. And then in the other community work that I've done, it's been a mix of those two things. And I think being really clear about why the people are there is really important, as you said, and also understanding sort of a commonality in what people want so that one group doesn't feel privileged over the other in the instruction. Because I think, although I was thinking about it, it still happened. And then there are people who don't even think about it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, we have another question here from Claire Fisher. Claire, I'm unmuting you.
All right, thank you very much. I like that line. I was thinking about it, and some people don't even think about it. So, Justin, I also liked your earlier point that someone with power might choose not to understand you. Kind of in both instances, I run up with my students sometimes. I have power, and I'm choosing to understand, and I'm choosing to think about your skills as a multilingual learner. However, your other professors are not. You know, because if I'm teaching in an IEP, they then have to go to an art history teacher who never had any training on how to work with multilingual learners. Or if I'm tutoring somebody, they then have to go back to the writing professor who had no interest in their non-standard grammar, right? So I was wondering if from your perspective, what's the best way to respond to a student who says, well, professor, you understand me, why don't my other professors? Or, hey, Claire, you said that's okay, but my other professor graded it wrong. How do you kind of deal with that?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to study in school. So I don't know if I have a good answer for you yet. Because part of the problem was I thought it was a skill thing. I thought that, well, I'm just good at understanding people's voices because I've been doing this for a while. And therefore, some people just don't have the experience. And well, that's why I was thinking with the deficit mindset, like, oh, well, they're going to have to, you know, put that work in because not everyone's going to have spent however many years in the classroom like I did. But then as I came to understand, as I said, you know, it really is a choice of someone, maybe the unfamiliarity is a real thing, right? If you've never heard someone say something a certain way, at first blush or first sound, it may sound different to you. And the choice is to reject it or accept it, or to take that extra 10% of effort and please, Neptune, stop. And 10% of effort and really understand it. But yeah, so I don't know if I answered your question, but I think it's really important, and this is what I'm doing research and writing about, to frame it in a way that makes them understand that some people will not make the choice, but also that we are making the choice, me, you, and whomever, because if they start to see it as some people are making the choice to do it, like that it's intentional, then I think it might help them feel a little bit less marginalized if they're in a situation where they're talking to someone and that person doesn't understand them, especially for someone who they've spoken to more than once, then they can think, oh, this person's choosing not to understand me. It helps a little bit more than to think, well, I'm just bad at this. I don't know if I answered the question or not.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, any of our other panelists want to address that, or we move on to another question?
I can. When I was in high school, I used to have that problem where I had one teacher. Let me go back. When I was in City College, my mom went to New Rochelle and she had a professor. And then when I went to City College, I had the same professor. And she gave the same topic that my mom was doing night school and I was doing City College during the day. And my mom and we worked on the projects together. So she handed it in to the teacher and the teacher gave her an A. And then she gave me a B minus. And then she told me it was because my language wasn't there. However, my mom, my mom came to this country when she was 2. My mother's English is almost perfect, unlike mine's that's, you know, a little bit broken sometimes. And so that's a little background. When I approached her and I was like, the paper's almost the same as my mother, and I show her the papers, like, well, you gave her an A and then you gave me a B. What was the reasoning? She told me because I was younger and because I look more Spanish. Because my she didn't say that. My mom is white and she has black hair and blue eyes, and I was more dark skinned than she was. In high school, I had the same problem where my social studies teacher was more lenient on my writing as long as all the facts were there. but my English teacher was a little bit tougher. Whereas, you know, she told me I had to do things correctly. And I remember mispronouncing one word one time and just stopped speaking altogether in class. So all the teachers need to be on the same. It's back to this culturally being respected with everybody. They do it more now than they did back then, but it makes you feel small, and it makes you feel, and it really does make you feel that like you don't belong in places, and it's the reason why a lot of people stop and they quit and they go do something else.
Could I jump in to say, I think that's why it's important, the certificate program at the new school, where they're trying to teach other teachers about how to teach language learners. They're not teaching them how to teach language, but how to teach language learners. And I assume, not that I'm in the program, but that part of what they're doing is getting them more familiar with what happens when language learners speak English. So I think that that sort of thing, it's not possible to do everywhere all of a sudden, but that sort of thing really needs to go in, because a lot of the time you get only this one-way street where the people whose English is not their first language need to improve, but the people who are listening don't necessarily need to do anything. And
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is a major challenge. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Rayton Gerald, I think, has a question for us. Rayton? Rayton, I've unmuted you.
Yeah, I was just curious as to if English is the dominant language, and it is, what is a reasonable approach to striking balance of it, particularly in the case where a person is in an English-speaking country?
Okay, Dad. Well, I think that we can't be impractical with this, right? Because if we are in New York, even in a place that's very diverse, English is still dominant, right? And so if we are so idealistic that we pretend that, oh, you don't need to learn any English at all, and you know, things will not be more difficult for you, then we're lying to ourselves and to our students, and we can't do that. However, what we need to do is try to make it so that whatever version of English that they speak, and people who've been here for a certain amount of time, even if they don't speak quote unquote, such like quote unquote academic English or business English or whatever, they speak some version of English, whether it's whatever country they may have come from, that version of English. We need to make sure that they understand that their version of English is respected, and therefore they can adapt their, sort of an idiolect, the way that they speak, and make sure that they have respect for that. They're going to have to make a journey, but the fact is they know that already. And we also need to see where they're trying to get and try to make the institutions that they're trying to access have respect for the way that they might be able to express themselves. So it's a lot of work. And right now we're only doing one half of the work on the learners, but we also have to do work on the institution and make sure that they understand that the version of English that they speak is not inferior, even though they know they're going to have to add some version of English to what they have.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anybody else want to address that question about the dominance of English? Okay. So next, Meredith, I believe, has a question for us. I've unmuted you, Meredith. Please go ahead. Meredith, are you there? No. Okay, we'll move on. Hope for Y. Yasmin, I believe. I've unmuted you. I think you have a question for us.
Yes. So, I mean, a lot was mentioned about this issue of, how people kind of perceive intelligibility, right? So, I mean, my question is, how do you think we as educators can strive to solve this issue of the limited lens with which people perceive intelligibility? I mean, what can we really do to make the situation better, is my question.
I can speak to that a little bit, because intelligibility is something that, has been really focused on in my area of work with TFCS. One of the major sort of areas of research, because there have been attempts to try to address these biases and the limited lens, as you say, and what can we do and what can educators do. And so one of the areas that's been explored is, somebody mentioned simple familiarity and exposure to a variety of accents in English, a variety of dialects of English. And so bringing in verbal and written texts into our classrooms that are representative of a more diverse range of voices is one really critical thing that we can do, including for our non-native English speakers, who of course would benefit from seeing models of successful speakers who have accents or whose grammar isn't 100% standard. So that's one thing, and that also can benefit monolingual speakers of English, and who need to have a more normalized view of the diversity of English and speakers out there. I mean, I grew up in North Carolina with almost entirely monolingual, interlocutors around me all the time, and so, it wasn't until I went to college and then grad school, and certainly here in New York, that I got even more exposure to those voices. And so having that familiarity early on is really critical. Another thing that can be done is for educators to create these curated and somewhat structured experiences where different groups of people who speak different languages can intermingle, and most likely in those cases use English or maybe other languages together, and become more familiar with one another's experiences. It's essentially perspective taking. And so those kinds of experiences, for example, one type of study that was done was to bring international TAs together with their potential students and to solve puzzles together. And that work was not even just explicitly discussing language, but just that work together had beneficial effects on those relationships, and the students reported, understanding of content throughout. So those kinds of experiences, bringing in diverse voices and texts, that all can really have a beneficial impact on widening what native speaking listeners and any listeners will consider to be and find intelligible.
Any other panelists want to address that?
One of the things that I did back when I was sort of like, my second year in Korea, I really didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I needed to do something. And I found, I can't remember what it was called, but there's corpuses of different English accents, English like the language, not the country. And you can just play them, and they'll be playing the same paragraph or a few paragraphs, and it's people from different regions, and it's not just countries. In fact, I was making a point, especially because I was teaching American English to the Korean students, of playing, all right, here is a person from, and they knew some of the states. Here's a person from Brooklyn. Here is a person from California. Not to say everyone from Brooklyn sounds that way, right? Because they had 2 different people from Brooklyn, and they had 2 people from the Bronx or whatever, and their age was different, and their race was different, things like that. And it was really important. I'm fighting with my dog. It was really important for them to see that, because they said that's not English, and these were not people who were being discriminatory. They simply hadn't heard it before. And I think that that's important for language learners, but it's also important for people who are monolingual to hear. Like, people here in New York are aware that people in the South have different accents, but how aware are they that North Carolina sounds different from Tallahassee, right? How much time have they spent really listening to that and being able to understand that? They just think, it's the South, where it's not. And even Western North Carolina, Eastern, and so forth. I think I made my point.
Okay, great, thank you. Christopher Nazara, I think you have a question for us. I'm unmuting you.
Hi, sorry, I think my mic is really low, but my question is about, in your bios, what I was thinking about while you were all talking about introducing yourselves and things like that, the different layers and tiers of types of schools you've worked at. And as much as we're talking about institutions, I think something that all the time gets left unsaid is working conditions for teachers and how that affects that. So I'd like to know what each of you think about places where you are working or where you have worked, things that are going well or not well, and kind of just overarching these, just talk more about the institutional kind of stuff. Thank you.
So I do more community ESL, which basically goes hand in hand with my after school programs, where first of all, after school is barely funded, and to do parent engagement is even less money. So I've been lucky in a sense that the principals have always supported me on anything that I needed. However, I don't have text that for adults. I use a lot of stuff that I have for the children. So, for example, I use the cards that I use in the classroom with my kindergartens. I use it with the adults. They use the same program, which is called Foundation. So that's what we use. I use readers that they use in grades K through second. And then if I find that I have students that are a little bit higher, then I go and I tap into the fifth grade. I've also worked in middle schools where teachers are very wasteful in New York City DOE, where when they get new supplies, they throw away the old stuff. So I pick up garbage basically, but it's books. I pick up boxes of books and stuff. And those are the things that I use. I use the printers. I use schools as far as print stuff for my students. I print out posters for them. Google Classrooms has been a lifesaver. That's why I supplement a lot of things that I can't print out. I post it up for them. I think because I'm used to working with so little bit anyway, that for me to teach, I just use what I use in after school, and I barter with other teachers, and I trade things with them. And I have, when we have these meetings, I ask them if they need something, and I have it. I have books I make copies of, and I just store it for the next time. So again, I have been, I think, the luckiest person doing this, because I've had multiple principals supporting me on this. And it's just go into the closet and go take what you need. Go into, you need that, I'll order it for you for your parents, because it's all about everybody working together. Again, no textbooks, no nothing, nothing from Cambridge, and nothing from that. I just use whatever I have for the kids in the classroom.
If I could jump in here, I have a couple of answers to that. So the interesting thing is, right now I'm not teaching language. I do employee training for this. Well, technically I work for CUNY, but my participants are city government workers. And it's like literally employee training. A lot of them happen to be language learners, but it's not teaching them the language. Why do I do that? Because it was, precarious doing a lot of the language teaching. On the other hand, I'm also back in school because I would like to change these conditions. I would like to change the industry, right? The idea is that as I continue to speak more and write more and be more public with my, advocacy, more people might pay attention to me. Is why I have the podcast. Now, the podcast itself, which I'm not going to advertise, but the point about it is that I think we need to break out of the traditional ways of trying to reach people, because they don't know that it, like what? Yes, I have a journal article published, and that's nice, and there's my son in the background. But how many people actually read them? There's so many paywalls, right? Or I want to, reach as many people as possible with ideas that go against the grain, but within my school, and I'm going to do something for these 9 students, that's great, but like not much will change. So it's really, I'd say one answer is finding different avenues. The other thing I would say is that even in a precarious working condition, I have found very small ways to be somewhat subversive. The worst position I had, worst in terms of precarity, was the job I had in Flushing at unnamed school that you can see on the subway if we were all still riding the subway. And there, it was very clear it was put as many people in the room as possible to get money out of them, right? A lot of those schools are like that, right? And I remember we had a room that literally, like the room, you couldn't put more people in, which is funny to think about during social distancing. And I kept saying, there's no place for people to sit. What are you doing? They're like, oh, we signed them up. And so when I needed to leave there to get the nonprofit job, one thing that I tried to do was that we had preordained textbooks we had to use. And one of them was like, they were all bad. And then one of them was the worst. And we had these very just pro forma meetings that didn't mean anything. And one thing that we were allowed to do, even in a place like that, where when you got to enough hours to be full-time and get benefits, they would cut your hours. Even in a place like that, I was able to change the worst textbook out, because I worked with other teachers, and we not collective bargaining, I'm sure we would have been fired for that, but collectively worked with the administration to change one textbook. And yeah, that doesn't matter that much, but I think that those students benefited from not using that. And so there's small ways, even in a terrible situation, that one can actually try to make things better for the people in front of you.
Yeah, and I think, you know, obviously, the fact that we are here now talking about these ideas, I hope, otherwise we're just wasting our time, right? I hope that this is a way that we can kind of push for some sort of deep structural change. And as Justin says, maybe it's incremental, maybe it's just, you know, getting rid of one terrible book at a time. You know, we can also be hopeful that we can make more major shifts, particularly this time now with COVID-19. I think we're in a time when people realize something big is happening, and this puts us in a situation where we're expecting big responses to this. So let us hope that, you know, this dialogue tonight can lead to pushing for some bigger changes, you know, than just one textbook at a time. But yeah, it's a major challenge. These big structural changes, the structure, the system reinforces itself. I mean, this, you know, it's unfortunate. Big changes, revolutions happen.
Sorry, Leo.
Yeah,
if I
go
could
ahead.
just add something really quickly, and also in response to something that Justin mentioned a few questions ago about the New School certificate in teaching English and what structurally we might be doing in that program to push for these changes that we're all here tonight to talk about. I teach grammar and I teach pronunciation pedagogy in that program. It's been a really amazing opportunity so far. And I am trying to incrementally make changes, but one of the reasons I'm so thrilled to be here tonight is to get more ideas and thoughts from you guys. So in addition to, you know, being privileged to have a lot of resources through that program to teach with and being able to use the really extensive knowledge and expertise that all the students have always brought in, I really have a hope that with that kind of collaboration and with the environment here that's being cultivated, we can make those kinds of structural changes. So.
Sorry, Mimi, I believe, has a question. Thank you, everybody. Mimi, I'm unmuting you now.
Hi, I have a question for Justin. I recently listened to Unstandardized English, and I listened to the talk that you had given at New York State TESOL about the altruistic shield. And I wondered, I know it's, you know, it was a half-an-hour talk, but I just wondered for tonight if there's a way you could condense it in a way and just speak a little bit about it, because I thought it was really relevant and I really enjoyed it.
Well, that's good. I guess the podcast is working, because what I've noticed about academia is that we do all of this stuff, we prepare for 6 months, and you go to a conference, and that was a well-attended presentation, and there were like 30 people there. So, and half of them are like here today. So it's like, there's just not that many people that go to these things. So that's why I put on the podcast and more people listen, and it worked. Anyway, so the altruistic shield, which I've kind of been talking about without naming, is just this idea that I have where, and it's not just language teachers, it's just that that's my field, where people who work in quote unquote pro-social or socially good professions, so that would be language teaching in general, use the idea that their profession is inherently good to shield themselves from accusations that they're perpetuating oppression. My focus was on race and racism, but it could be other kinds of oppression. Just that's my lens. So the fact being that I noticed it because whenever I would talk about race or racism, people would come back at me like, oh, but I teach language students, you know, as if to say like I am already good, you know? And my idea isn't just that that exists, which I guess I could do an empirical study, but that's not the point, it's a theory, is that is much more of an obstacle for changing oppressive structures than the out and out hatefulness that we see on the news, which is bad and a problem and dangerous. But like, you know, you can kind of see that coming. But when people are really resistant to make changes because they think that what they're doing is good, not just neutral, but they think what they're doing is already solving the problem, then how do you get them to change? I don't have an answer to how they're going to change yet. That's kind of what there's my son, kind of what my my research is about. But that's the point of the altruistic shield, or the idea that like people who, and it's true in our field, think that what they do is automatically, you know, helping people, are much more reluctant to address the potential that they are themselves complicit in the oppression that they think they're trying to fight. So that's the idea.
Okay, thank you.
Hi.
Roshi.
Hi. Such an interesting discussion. Thank you. Sorry, I have a sore throat. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I was wondering if any of you were there at the event the New School hosted, Testifying While Black, African American English and Judicial Linguistics.
I mean, I've heard it. I heard it. It wasn't there yet.
Maybe Leo can. I was very struck by this idea that in Philadelphia, and we're talking about New York being diverse, in Philadelphia, there are actually people, court reporters, who consistently fail to meet 95% accuracy, transcription accuracy, that is, when asked to transcribe examples of spoken AAE. So as teachers, what do you think we can do to address this issue? Because here are people that are being, you know, unfairly, whatever, you know, witnesses or jailed or imprisoned just because the court transcriptors could not understand the variety of English.
I mean, they need to learn, right? And the problem would be, my theory would be that if you told them, because what I do now is training, right? And it's not about this sort of thing. I do pretty technical training, so it's not about changing people's minds really. But if you took those people and put them in not those people, but those people you're speaking of, and you put them in a training situation that you need to go to training because you have not been getting people's English correct or their words correct, they'd probably start off really defensive, right? And I don't know that the way trainings right now are currently constructed is all that helpful, because they don't often take that sort of pride into account, right? Because if you go here, there's implicit bias training, this idea everybody has biases, and we do, but it's not direct or specific enough to point out like you are doing things that can lead to people's imprisonment. In that case, it could be other things. So I think trainings, because I don't know you're going to take someone in that position and be like, you're going to go get a master's degree. Like, they might have one, but it's not going to be in this. We need to develop a lot better training and education for these folks that forces them to be uncomfortable. And then when they get to sit in that discomfort, because that's the key, they don't shut down after the discomfort. The problem with all of this stuff is that people just stop once they get uncomfortable. And I get it. We talk about, oh, I can't remember our phrases. So I'm sorry. One of the things we talk about, affective filter, there you go. And we talk about people shutting down when they get uncomfortable for other reasons, and it happens there, but we need to find a way to educate people such that when they feel uncomfortable, they don't just stop. Others have thoughts on that? Because it's kind of a...
I think you're making a great point there, Justin. I mean, think, you know, Roshi's question about testifying while Black, you know, our study, our last social language and social justice talk with Taylor Jones and Jessica Kaltfeld, you know, explored how inaccurate our Philadelphia court reporters were in testifying African-American English. And the real life ramifications that this had. I mean, you know, the court reporters were writing down something that they heard, and that goes in as a matter of record. And when the witness then says, that's not what I said, they are then accused of committing perjury because this is part of their record. So this has real life, you know, implications. Now, clearly, as Justin says, one of the things is training. You know, helping people to understand African American English. But as the researchers said, yes, Philadelphia courts, there's a large African American English speaking population, but there are also other elements. And I think that's why Justin's point is so well taken, because it's a question of flexibility. It's a question, we struggle when we listen to something that's unfamiliar. It requires mental resources. It requires paying attention, which is uncomfortable. And that is something, people, when you reach a certain amount of discomfort, when you've listened to the professor drone on too long, when you've listened to, you've read a book too long and it's too many ideas to absorb, we have a limit that we shut down on. And I think with language, what happens is that many people dealing with the flexibility, there's so many different ways that we can express ourselves, so many ways that people can use language, so many different languages in the world and so many different varieties in the world, that's a huge challenge for people, particularly when you've lived in a more monolingual, monocultural situation, when you haven't been exposed to these things. But even if you have, there's a limit to how much flexibility we can get. And I think, Diane Larson Freeman has talked about, learning a second language. Perhaps one of the most important things we can do is encourage our students to be flexible, encourage them to embrace that discomfort that is going to come when you're learning something new, when you're surrounded by a new culture, by a new way of speaking, by a new way of communicating. That's difficult for just about everybody. Now, whether there are individual differences is another question, but I think everybody at some point feels a little uncomfortable when people are speaking a little differently or a lot differently. But we need, if we are going to establish a world, a more socially just world, a more interconnected world, a world where there's less violence and misunderstanding, we need to kind of accept that people are going to speak differently, and it's not just the responsibility of the weak and the powerless, as one of our panelists, I'm blanking on who mentioned this, but this interaction is not the responsibility only of the language learner. Also, particularly monolingual English speakers need to take responsibility for communication. It's not about the foreigner needs to understand English. The English speaker needs to understand the non-English speaker. Sorry, I'm going to put in a few.
Can I just add one thing there as well? Because I wasn't able to attend that event, but I was thinking about and listening to what Justin and Leo were saying, and I 100% agree with the points about exposure and the points about familiarity and discomfort, and leaning into discomfort being such an essential skill. And I think that that's something that as teachers, we do have the opportunity to do and set up environments for our students in which they have to lean into the kind of discomfort, even if it isn't always about language. But I think also, and this reminded me of what Janine said about her experience in mechanical engineering, and how her feeling of otherness and her being othered sort of forced her to leave. And maybe as educators, when we have students who want to go into, for example, court reporting, who are multi-dialectal or multilingual, I think it just reinforces the importance of encouraging more representation in those fields, so that in addition to increasing familiarity and exposure, there are people in those roles who are already able to code switch. Thanks.
You're muted, man. You're muted, man.
Thank you.
All right. Sorry, my apologies. I was muted. Thank you. So YT has a question. I'm going to unmute you now, YT.
Yes.
YT.
Yes. My name is Yanis Ziligas. Thank you very much. This was impressive. I have two questions, which are most likely linguistic questions. One of them ties up to the exact discussion we had just before, and it was exactly: is there any neurolinguistic explanation of why native speakers have such a harder time than foreign speakers of English to understand accents. So that's number one. Number two is, can you explain that now? The looking down upon also works, has a cut on the other side too. I've also noticed among foreign speakers that they always make fun of how Americans speak, for example, Spanish. I mean, I remember sometimes politicians try to do it, and it sounds so hideous. You know, it's commendable that they try to speak in Spanish, but their accent is so off. And that happens not just in Spanish, in French, you hear it, in German. And I wonder, why is that? Is there something with the phonetics of English that hinders the native speakers from adjusting to pronunciations of foreign languages? These two questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, great, thank you. Which of our panelists would like to address that first?
I think I can try and work on the second one there. I don't have a very empirical answer for the neurolinguistics aspect, but as far as people in other languages making fun of people whose first language is English, or specifically Americans, usually Americans speaking other languages, it depends to me on the language and the place, right? Because although English may be the dominant language in most contexts, there are other colonial languages, let's say, and varieties of those languages that are not necessarily, you know, they're still seen as prestigious in the world, right? Mostly Western languages, but, you know, for example, there's a difference between the way that people who speak Spanish, Castilian Spanish, are seen versus the way that people who speak Mexican Spanish are seen versus Dominican versus et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I say all of this as background to say that I tend to think if it is people from a marginalized group, which could be people from the Dominican Republic, could be people from Mexico, whatever. And then of course within there, right, there's income levels and so forth. If it's people from a marginalized group and they're making fun of the way an American speaks their language, I'm not saying it's nice to do, but I do tend to think that there is a place for anti-hegemonic humor, the same way that if someone is Black and they're being a little facetious about white folks, it's not quite the same as the other way around. And then also I would say, I'm not saying it's necessarily the best thing to do, but I do think it's not quite the same. Now, if I've also, I mean, this is my experiences. When I spoke other languages when I was in Asia, not spoke, but like used a few words in another language, in Korean, for example, people fell all over their place, all over themselves to talk about how good my Korean was. And all I did was say that I wanted to have some beer or some food, you know? So I'm sure it does happen because I have been, you know, I took French and I had friends who would laugh at the way some other people tried to speak French. So this certainly happens, but I do think that the relative statuses of the languages in the location that they're in and in the world does make a difference. It's not necessarily a good thing, but I do think that the humor can work as sort of a very small chip against the mountain of colonialism and so forth. And as you're saying, right, certain languages, especially like a French or especially other types of Western languages, are not going to be any better than we are in the United States about looking down on people for the way their language is spoken. So I think if it's especially like a hegemonic language like a French, and certain types of French, like French from France, looking down on people for speaking the language, it's the same thing as when we look down on people for speaking English incorrectly, sorry. And now if somebody wants to talk about the neurolinguistics of it, that would know more than me, I would appreciate that because I don't know.
Can I just say something about, I could only speak for New York City. I grew up here. The reason a lot of monolinguals sound funny speaking another language, especially Spanish, is because they don't learn it until they get into high school because it's a requirement to graduate. And what happens is, I know when I got thrown into high school, and I was taking Latin in middle school, but the high school I went to didn't have Latin, so they stuck me in a native Spanish class, where it was very different from the my Spanish 3 native was very different from Spanish 3 non-native class, where I was more into more literature, more speaking in the class, where my friends who were taking the same Spanish 3 class but non-native, they were learning like the basics, like when we teach English, and they don't emphasize it as much as they would do in my native class. My native class was taught by a native Spanish teacher, while the other one was taught by somebody that who had graduated and did had some kind of background in it, and they were teaching that class. My daughter just graduated in 2016 from high school, and they stuck her in a Spanish native class because of her last name, but her last name was French. So she doesn't speak, unfortunately, she doesn't speak Spanish. Her father is a monolingual. He's from Trinidad. He has that heavy accent, so she had, but she was doing this native class and she was crying and struggling. And because I'm a native, I didn't see anything wrong with it, because we were, I was going with her and trying to pronounce the words and roll those R's and everything. Her non-native people that didn't speak English like her, they couldn't do it either. So I think there's something about how the system is set up here that they should learn language, I think, earlier. We're doing dual language now in pre-K and K, and they're putting in it's a separation from bilingual class, where they learn the language English in the morning and the second language in the afternoon. It's the subjects. They go they just continue. And I was seeing I left the school a year ago, where my kindergartners were now in 3rd grade, who were non-native Spanish speakers, were speaking Spanish just as good as my native speakers. So I think the reason they're making fun of people is because back not to date myself, they weren't teaching them at an earlier age where they can grasp it, and I think respect it a little bit more. I mean, high school now, you just want to graduate, get your credits, and you get a 65, and that's it, that's passing, that's good enough. And then even going into CUNY, sometimes they waived our language requirement if you took the Regents exam in New York State. So there's no emphasis on keeping learning the language here. I don't know if that answered the question.
And I think that also plays into, thinking about the hierarchy that Justin was talking about. English, as we say in the abstract, is the hypercentral language following the Swan, right? It has this power, it has this prestige. And, if we look at Pierre Bourdieu's work, this idea that English is so powerful, I would argue that this is a strong disincentive for monolingual English speakers to even attempt to speak another language, because you speak the language of power. You have a position, because you speak that language, that speaking another language and sounding foolish, opening yourself up to ridicule, why would you do that when your language already dominates other languages? I've been in situations where I've been able to speak another language, and I've made a conscious choice to switch to English because I'm in a difficult situation, and I know if I speak in my foreign language, my second or third language, and I'm trying to communicate, I'm at a disadvantage. If I switch to English, I get the advantage. It's an advantage for me, and so there's a strong disincentive for monolingual English speakers to learn another language. The rest of the world is trying to learn English. And this is, enormously unfortunate, but it also plays into all of these questions of social justice. Because once you learn English, as Philipson says, this lingua frankensteinia, this linguistic imperialism that just obliterates other languages. And we think about, most Americans do not trace their ancestry back to the British Isles. My family story is my great-grandfather was French Canadian. My great-grandmother was German. She said, I'm not learning French. He said, I'm not learning German. And all my family after that spoke English only. And this is not an unusual situation. My wife is a Spanish speaker. My children are much more dominant in English. Some of them speak Spanish passingly, but none of them speak anything close to being fluent. So, this is the nature of English, dominates and pushes other languages to the side. And because of that, when English speakers do try to speak another language, they are open to ridicule. And as Justin says, yes, you can engage in some anti-hegemonic humor, but I would argue that kind of just reinforces this division between English is up on a pedestal, and there's no objective reason for that other than the political and military and economic situation that English is in. But I think Huilin Chen has a question for us now. Huilin, I've unmuted you.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you all. My question was, what about language euphoria? So the idea of like, what if, because I'm a student, but I've come to America and I learned language as English as my second language. I think a lot of that I've learned also, like in the beginning, not being able to speak well, and not feeling supported by teachers who are able to understand me at the time. But I was thinking, like, what about the idea of like supporting students by asking them like what they love about their own language first, and then having that in combination with teaching English, because a lot of that also, like, I've learned through my own gender explorations, is that it's not always talking about like struggles that we face because they're really real, but also like what do we love about like both English and our native languages, and how do we combine that? Yeah.
Thank you, Huilin. Any of our panelists want to respond?
Sorry, go ahead.
So when I was getting my master's in early childhood education, I had a class where a professor told us what's in your backpack. As a teacher, what you need to have in your backpack, and in a lot of things that we needed to have, other than we teach young kids, is to make sure they're okay as far as having food. We need to learn about their cultures. We need to learn about their language, and it's something that even if you're not perfect at it, you need to get to know who your students are. So you get that rostered a week or two before school starts. You just do a little background check on them. We do little surveys with the parents and things that they like, and we put it in our backpack, and then we use it. And we use it when we teach them language and when we teach them in the classroom. And sometimes it's like, I had when I first started this a long time ago, and I was in doing after school, I didn't realize that my Bengali parents, I couldn't speak to the mom, and I had to speak to the dad, and the dad wasn't present. I had to speak to the oldest son, who was the brat that was in my class. So it's a lot of things about by learning about their culture and how it goes and stuff and things like that. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, thank you, Kim.
Yeah. So and I think what I'm thinking, what occurred to me when you were asking your question, you were sort of describing what you were saying, Huilin, was grammar, because I'm big into grammar. Can't help it, it's the way that I am. And a lot of times when I find that both for learners and for multilingual, balanced multilingual teacher candidates, I find that one of the best ways that they learn English grammar, something like the passive voice, how is that? What is that all about? Is to ask them to bring in any other languages that they speak, and to think really carefully and closely about how those languages construct or express the passive, or how they do relative clauses. And I think that asking them to think about their other languages in this really metalinguistic way is something that for many of them, they've done for the first time. And for English, that happens for all of us too. And they tend to find that really illuminating, and really, I think it helps them, and they've expressed this to me, it really sort of helps them see the systematicity that's present in not only the English that they're maybe acquired as a second language and are learning to teach, but in the languages that they've spoken their entire lives, and to kind of see the elegance and the beauty there. And so I've never heard the term language euphoria, but I found that there is a lot of joy and curiosity that gets sparked in conversations like that.
And I think that's a great point. I think at the beginning of my teaching career many years ago, I was very heavily influenced by the idea English only. It's like just eliminate, don't put a role for the L1 at all in the classroom. And my mind has changed on that, and the field as a whole has moved enormously towards recognizing the critical importance of the L1 and valuing the L1. As Kim says, as a way to, to explore that, and as Janire was saying, to kind of engage with that and honor that, and the whole translanguaging movement in the field, I think, also talks about how critical it is to, it's not this subtractive bilingualism that we want. We don't want to lose that first language. We want additive bilingualism. Being able to speak multiple languages is an amazing skill and a very beneficial one. And that's something that we really need to, as language teachers, it still shocks me that there are still so many practitioners who are saying no L1 in the classroom, English only, English only. I'm just stunned how prevalent and how dominant that idea is in the field still, sadly. Okay, I think Peggy, you have a question for us. So just gotta find you and then, okay, I'm gonna unmute you. Okay, Peggy, go ahead.
Hi, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you for this panel. It's really interesting, and appreciate everything everybody said. I was thinking about the implications of all this for beginning English language learners. I think it's easier to have these conversations, some of the conversations that we've discussed with higher level English language learners. You can begin to address some of these issues with them at whatever level, that even if they're intermediate or, but when an English language learner is a true beginner or a lower level, I was just wondering if any of the panelists had any suggestions for how we communicate this sort of ethos, if not the specific ideas themselves, to these lower level or these beginning level English language learners. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peggy. Anybody you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason that when I was in charge of the department with the adult learners that I gave myself the advanced class, because I felt like I could do more of this. So yeah, your question is well taken. I think that you have to start small with learners who certainly understand complex ideas, just not the language used to express them in English. So I think it's a little bit easier to start on the path by removing some of the hierarchy in the language when you're constructing both lessons and programs there. You may not be able, like, I'm not going to go into a class right now and someone who doesn't know the Roman alphabet and be like, so let's talk about the white listener. Like, it's not going to work. But I can think about my materials, right? I can think about my textbooks. I can make it so when they see a visual or when they hear something, it is not reinforcing ideas that are otherwise, harmful. Because I think a lot of the problem is that people like me, I go in and I want to do all this interesting stuff or things that I think are interesting, but I don't really start doing it until the class is a higher level because that's who I was teaching. Well, now they've been probably taking English for however many years, and all the things we've been talking about have already happened to them. They felt like Jaire, where they felt really, othered, they felt left out, marginalized, and then I'm going to come and I'm going to change everything. Well, it's good that I do that, but we do need to start earlier in the process if we can. If they're coming to us and they've never studied the language before, or they've never heard beyond the whatever they see on television, then we can change the way that it's framed, even if we can't use but so much language or so much text ourselves. So I think, you know, the way the lessons and the way the materials, it doesn't have to be a textbook, but you're still using some sort of material, is framed, that removes some of the hierarchy, and, you know, go through one's work and think about the ways in which a deficit mindset is just already there from the beginning, and think about how you can challenge that. It doesn't even have to be all that explicit. It just has to be intentional, I think.
Yeah, and I think, you know, as I mentioned in the previous answer, with translanguaging, I think just a recognition of the value of the learner's first language, their home language, it goes an enormous way. And just to get them thinking about language as a conception, because a lot of people come in with a language ideology, an understanding of what they think about the world in terms of language, but they don't necessarily have a deep analytical understanding of language. And so just getting them to think about what they know about their own language is a great way to help them to make connections with English as a language. And I think that is plus recognizing and valuing their home language. I think those two are things that are great ways to start off, even with beginners. That you can recognize their language and say, okay, your language has value. You're not coming in as a blank slate. You already know a lot about language. Let's move that, transition that over to English and see those connections.
So to address Peggy, I teach a lot of beginners also, and the opportunity that I have with them is because I also do youth development, and I teach kindergartners about social justice, and I think it can be implemented as the part of the learning language. Things like the block, why I'm being blocked type of thing. So for example, again, I don't teach in a school, I never taught abroad, but in the community that I teach, I find that my beginners Chinese students and my beginner Spanish students, once they find something in common, then they start having those conversations slowly and surely. Broken English, they use the Google Translate to help them. How do we do this? So usually it's about the school system, how the teachers are treating their kids because they don't know the language. So that seems to be they have something in common, and the conversation goes a little bit higher from there. And I know I could teach it to kindergartners because I teach them social justice in the classroom, where, you know, how to advocate for myself. And then that's what I'm trying to teach our Chinese students and our Arabic students. And in those classes, I have the highest participation when it comes to speaking and listening, is when they have the common enemy. And I think they do understand it, and you can teach it in the beginning. It's just you have to be very careful how you bring it in and how you tackle it, because you don't want the class to go off to a different tangent and not where you want it to go. But it can be done. It just has to be more specific, more targeted. So.
And I'll just add one other short point that I think everyone has made really good sort of, or put out some really important ideas and issues. And I think what everyone's kind of, one theme that I'm seeing is that it's at this, for a beginner level, it's really about showing and not just telling. Although I definitely agree that teaching self-advocacy can start early on. I think one of the issues that I talk to my grammar students, my teachers, my students of grammar teaching about a lot is when and how to give feedback, and how to address errors that learners might make, and how to determine what kind of feedback to give and when to give it. And I think one way that you can show this respect for beginners early on, even if you're not able to explain the whole idea about listener bias, is to provide feedback on their language in a really thoughtful way, so that it isn't a sort of a blanket, let me correct everything that I think needs to be corrected, but rather a really carefully chosen one or two things that you think are really going to be important for that learner's success. And so that's one strategy that we've talked about in my classes that they found to be helpful at that level.
Thank you so much. So last call for any questions. I hope I didn't miss anybody in the chat, but if you have, just put something in the chat now, otherwise. Okay, so thank you all for joining us, and thank you again to our panelists, Janire, Kim, and Justin. Thank you all for your insights. Wish you all the best and hope to see you at our future discussions on language and social justice. Take care and have a great night. Stay well.